Somewhere in the Pacific, on a dirt airstrip carved out of jungle, a team of American engineers is taking apart a Japanese bomber. The year is 1943. The aircraft is a Mitsubishi G4M, the plane the Allies call Betty. It is the backbone of Japan's land-based bomber force, and this is one of the first examples the Americans have been able to examine up close. The engineers work carefully. They photograph every panel, every rivet, every cable. They pull away the aluminum skin and inspect the internal structure. They open the fuel tanks built into the wings, and then they stop. There is no self-sealing rubber lining inside, no protective bladder, no sponge-like material designed to swell and close a bullet hole. The fuel sits behind nothing but thin metal. A single round from a fighter's machine gun would puncture the tank and ignite the fuel inside. In early G4M models, the fuel system had far less protection than many Allied aircraft, which made the bomber unusually vulnerable to fire when hit. American fighter pilots already knew this from experience. They had given the aircraft a nickname. They called it the one-shot lighter. The engineers continued their inspection. Behind the pilot's seat, there was no armor plate. In most American and British bombers of this era, a fixed slab of steel sat between the pilot and the rear of the aircraft, designed to stop bullets and shrapnel from killing the man flying the plane. Betty had nothing. The fuel lines running through the fuselage were unprotected. The structural members were light, built to save weight at every opportunity. There was almost no redundancy in the airframe. If a critical spar took a hit, the wing could fail. Compare this to what the Americans were flying. The North American B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engine medium bomber of roughly the same era, had self-sealing fuel cells from the B-25A model onward. It had armor plate behind the crew. Its fuel lines were designed to resist puncture. British bombers carried similar protections. By 1942, many Allied frontline aircraft used self-sealing tanks and added armor, though protection levels still varied by model and mission. And yet here was Japan's most important land-based bomber, stripped bare of every feature designed to bring the crew home alive. The American engineers assumed this was a mistake, some kind of manufacturing shortcut. An oversight by designers who did not understand modern air combat. It was not a mistake. To understand why the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber was built this way, you have to understand the problem Japan was trying to solve, and that problem begins with geography. Japan is an island nation. Its empire, at its greatest extent in 1942, stretched across thousands of miles of open ocean, from the home islands to the far reaches of the South Pacific. Defending that empire and projecting military power across it meant flying over enormous distances of water. There were no convenient chains of Allied-style airfields spaced a few hundred miles apart. Japanese bombers needed to fly from bases like Rabaul in New Britain to targets in the Solomon Islands and back, a round trip of over 1,000 miles, and the Imperial Japanese Navy wanted even more. In September 1937, the Navy issued specifications to Mitsubishi for a new land-based attack bomber. The requirements were, by any standard of the time, extreme. The Navy wanted a twin-engine bomber that could reach a top speed of about 250 miles per hour, fly at a cruising altitude of roughly 10,000 feet, and carry an 1,800-pound torpedo, or the same weight in bombs. The range requirement was the one that mattered most. Without a torpedo, the new bomber was expected to fly nearly 3,000 miles. With a full combat load, it still needed a range of about 2,300 miles. No bomber in the world at that time could do this. The American B-25, by comparison, had a combat range of roughly 1,300 miles. The Navy's demand was almost double. Here is the key. Range requires fuel. Fuel is heavy. Tanks are heavy. And every additional pound of weight reduces the distance an aircraft can fly. An armor plate to protect the crew adds weight. Self-sealing fuel tanks, which require a thick layer of rubber around the fuel cells, add both weight and bulk, reducing the amount of fuel the tanks can hold. The self-sealing system alone would have added roughly 660 pounds and significantly reduced fuel capacity. For Mitsubishi's design team, led by engineer Kiro Honjo, this created an impossible equation. The Navy's range specifications could not be met if the aircraft carried armor and self-sealing tanks. It was one or the other: extreme range or crew protection. Japan chose range. Honjo was not an amateur. He was one of Japan's most experienced aircraft designers, a graduate of the University of Tokyo who had been born in 1901 and devoted his career to aviation. He had studied bomber design at the Junkers Works in Germany. He had designed the earlier G4M, the Betty's predecessor, which had also sacrificed protection for range. And he had recently returned from a fact-finding visit to the United States in 1938, where he observed American manufacturing methods firsthand. He understood what he was building. His team at Mitsubishi knew exactly what the absence of armor and self-sealing tanks would mean in combat. The design was not an oversight. It was a deliberate, calculated trade-off driven by strategic necessity. The math was simple and brutal. Adding self-sealing protection to the fuel tanks would have required a thick layer of soft rubber, roughly 1.25 inches, either inside or outside each tank. That rubber lining would have weighed about 660 pounds, and it would have reduced the volume of fuel the tanks could hold. Combined with crew armor, the weight penalty would have cut hundreds of miles from the Betty's range, dropping it below what the Navy demanded. Honjo chose fuel over rubber, range over survival. The first G4M prototype was completed in September 1939 and transported in pieces by ox cart to Kagamigahara Airfield, about 30 miles from Mitsubishi's Nagoya factory, because the plant had no runway of its own. Japan's newest and most advanced bomber made the journey disassembled and stacked on farm carts over unpaved roads. Test pilot Katsuzo Shima flew it for the first time on October 23, 1939. The results were impressive. The second prototype exceeded the Navy's speed requirements and demonstrated a range of more than 30,400 miles without payload. Betty could do what no other bomber in the world could do. It could strike targets at distances that seemed impossible, and it achieved this by building the entire wing as one enormous fuel tank, with fuel cells neatly defined by the main spar and a secondary spar, the surfaces of the wings themselves forming the walls of the container. The engineering was elegant. It was also the reason the aircraft would burn. There was no room and no weight allowance for protection. Some later accounts describe internal nicknames for the design, but the key point is simpler. It achieved range by saving weight wherever possible. The first production G4M rolled off the line in April 1941. Within months, Betty would prove its worth in the most dramatic way possible. On December 10, 1941, just 3 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a combined force of G4M and G3M bombers flying from bases near Saigon in French Indochina found and attacked a British naval squadron known as Force Z in the South China Sea off the coast of Malaya. The squadron included the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, one of the most modern warships in the Royal Navy, and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The British ships had no air cover. The Japanese torpedo bombers struck from multiple directions, flying at extremely low altitude. Prince of Wales took a devastating torpedo hit early in the engagement that knocked out her steering and flooded multiple compartments. Repulse dodged many of the attacks through aggressive maneuvering, but was eventually overwhelmed, taking at least 5 torpedo hits before capsizing and sinking. The Prince of Wales followed shortly after. About 840 British sailors were lost. It was the first time in history that capital ships actively defending themselves were sunk solely by air power while underway in the open sea. The Betty had proven that its extraordinary range and torpedo-carrying ability could change the course of a naval battle. Against opponents who lacked strong fighter opposition, the bomber was devastating. But the war did not stay on Japan's terms for long. By August 1942, the United States had landed Marines on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese needed to drive them off. The primary weapon available was the G4M, flying from the major Japanese base at Rabaul, roughly 560 miles away. The bombers flew these missions almost daily, arriving over Guadalcanal around noon in tight formations at high altitude, escorted by Zero fighters. And now they were meeting real opposition. American Wildcat fighters scrambled from Henderson Field, tore into the bomber formations. The results were catastrophic. The Betty's enormous, fuel-filled wings lit up when hit by the Wildcat's heavy machine guns. The nickname, the one-shot lighter, proved grimly accurate. Over the Guadalcanal campaign, losses mounted quickly. One estimate counts roughly 90 or more G4M bombers lost from late August into mid-November 1942. Some air groups lost more than half their strength in a matter of weeks. In some raids, only a small fraction of the bombers made it back in flying condition. The 8-hour round trip from Rabaul to Guadalcanal and back, pushing the limits of even Betty's remarkable range, left exhausted crews vulnerable on every sortie. The very quality that made the bomber strategically necessary, its ability to reach distant targets, meant that each mission was long, grueling, and offered little margin for error. Now let us talk about the most famous Betty of all. On April 14, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted and decrypted a Japanese naval message. It contained a detailed travel schedule for Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. Yamamoto planned to fly from Rabaul to the area near Bougainville in the Solomon Islands on the morning of April 18 to inspect forward bases. The message specified that the Admiral would be traveling in a G4M Betty bomber escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The decrypted schedule moved quickly through senior command channels as planners considered whether an intercept was possible. Senior commanders authorized an intercept mission once the schedule was confirmed. The only American fighter with the range to reach the intercept point and return was the P-38 Lightning. Major John Mitchell of the 39th Fighter Squadron planned the mission in precise detail. 16 P-38s would fly a roundabout low-altitude route of roughly 600 miles to avoid detection, arriving at the interception point at almost exactly the moment Yamamoto's flight was scheduled to pass. Early on April 18, 1943, the P-38 force launched from Guadalcanal. 16 aircraft ultimately continued toward the intercept area. After more than 2 hours of radio silence flying just above the waves, they arrived at the coast of Bougainville almost exactly on schedule. And there, descending through a light haze at about 6,500 feet, were 2 Betty bombers and 6 Zeros. The Americans had expected only one bomber. They had to try to destroy both. In the ensuing fight, American pilots attacked the lead bomber. Later accounts and reviews have debated credit for the shootdown. The bomber trailed heavy black smoke, rolled to the left, and plunged into the jungle. The second Betty, carrying Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, was hit and crash-landed in the sea. Ugaki survived. Yamamoto did not. A Japanese search party found the Admiral's body the next day. He had been thrown from the wreckage, still strapped in his seat, his hand gripping his sword. An autopsy later determined he had been killed by gunfire before the crash. The aircraft that carried Japan's most important admiral reflected a design that prioritized range over protection. It burned easily because protection was sacrificed to meet demanding range requirements. The Betty's unprotected fuel tanks, the very feature that gave it the range to carry Yamamoto across the vast distances of the Pacific, made it fatally vulnerable the moment an enemy fighter found it. Japan's most famous admiral died in the aircraft that best represented Japan's strategic dilemma: reach far, but burn easily. Now let us zoom out. Because Betty was not unique, it was part of a broader pattern in Japanese aircraft design during the Second World War, a pattern that ran through nearly every major combat aircraft Japan produced in the war's early years. The most famous example is the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, Japan's iconic carrier-based fighter. The Zero was designed by Jiro Horikoshi, a colleague and friend of Kiro Honjo, the Betty's designer. Both men worked at Mitsubishi. Both faced the same fundamental challenge: building aircraft that could operate across the enormous distances of the Pacific, with engines that produced less horsepower than their American and British equivalents. Horikoshi solved the problem the same way Hanjo did. He stripped weight. The Zero had no armor plate behind the pilot. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. Its airframe was built as light as physically possible, with holes drilled and cut through every internal component that could tolerate it. The result was an extraordinary performance. The Zero could outmaneuver any Allied fighter it faced in 1941 and 1942. Its range over 1,600 miles was astonishing for a single-engine fighter. But like the Betty, it paid a terrible price when hit. Zeros caught fire easily and came apart under concentrated gunfire. As the war progressed and American pilots learned to exploit these weaknesses, using diving attacks and refusing to engage in turning fights, the Zero's lack of protection became a death sentence for its pilots. Japanese aviation doctrine and strategic constraints emphasized long-range offensive reach, which shaped these design priorities. This was not stupidity, it was not ignorance. It was a coherent, if terrifying, philosophy applied to engineering. Japan faced limits in engine power growth and production capacity compared with the United States, which increased pressure to save weight. In the late 1930s, Japan's most powerful aircraft engines produced around 1,000 to 1,500 horsepower, while American and British manufacturers were already pushing toward 2,000 horsepower with clear growth potential ahead. If you cannot build a more powerful engine, you must build a lighter aircraft. And if you build a lighter aircraft, the weight you save has to come from somewhere. In American and British design philosophy, the weight went into protection. Armor plate, self-sealing tanks, structural redundancy. The idea was that a crew that survived today could fight again tomorrow. Japan made the opposite choice. The weight went into fuel and performance. The idea was that reaching the target mattered more than returning from it. Japan also lacked the strategic depth to place airfields close to every potential theater of operations. And critically, it lacked the pilot training infrastructure to quickly replace lost aircrew. The decision to sacrifice protection for performance was logical within these constraints, but it created a cascading problem. As experienced pilots and crews were killed in aircraft that could not absorb damage, they were replaced by less experienced men, flying the same vulnerable aircraft against increasingly skilled and well-equipped opponents. By 1944, the quality gap between Japanese and American aircrews had become enormous. The spiral was relentless, and it had been set in motion years earlier, in part by the very design decisions that gave Japan its initial advantage. Mitsubishi tried to address Betty's weaknesses as the war continued. After about 660 aircraft had been built, the company began applying a thick rubber layer to the outside of the lower wing surfaces to provide some fire protection. Later models, the G4M series, introduced improved engines and other modifications, but the fundamental vulnerability remained. The final version, the G4M3 Model 34, at last included genuine self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plate for the crew. Later versions added more protection, but this typically reduced fuel volume and range. Only a limited number were produced before the war ended. They arrived far too late to change the course of the war. By then, the Betty had already been pressed into service as the mothership for the Oka, a rocket-powered suicide weapon carried beneath the bomber's belly. The aircraft that had been built to reach distant targets was now carrying men on one-way missions. The logic of the original design, reached far at any cost, had found its darkest expression. So what did America learn from all of this? The examination of captured Japanese aircraft became one of the most valuable intelligence programs of the Pacific War. Beginning in late 1942, the Allies established technical air intelligence units known as TAIUs, joint teams of American, Australian, and British specialists who recovered crashed and captured Japanese aircraft across the Pacific. The first unit was set up at Eagle Farm Air Base in Brisbane, Australia in November 1942, operating from a single hangar. These teams operated under dangerous conditions, often near the front lines, disassembling wrecked aircraft, photographing every component, recording serial numbers, and manufacturing details. They compiled standardized crashed enemy aircraft reports that documented everything from the type of metal alloys used in the airframe to the serial numbers on individual engine parts. These details gave intelligence analysts a picture not just of each aircraft's capabilities, but of the broader health of Japan's war economy. Aircraft that were not too badly damaged were rebuilt and test-flown. The most famous example was the Akuten Zero, a nearly intact A-6M that crash-landed on an island off Alaska in June 1942 after its pilot was killed. The aircraft was recovered by the Navy and shipped to California, where it was repaired and flown extensively. American test pilots staged mock dogfights between the captured Zero and current American fighters, confirming its strengths and identifying its weaknesses with precision. A captured G4M Betty was similarly evaluated, and the insights gained were immediate and practical. American pilots learned exactly where Japanese aircraft were most vulnerable. They learned that Betty's wings, filled with unprotected fuel, would ignite from concentrated fire at specific points along the wing. They learned that the Zero could be defeated by refusing to engage in the slow-speed turning fights where it excelled, and instead using high-speed diving attacks that exploited its fragile structure. These intelligence reports were translated into tactical guidance that reached fighter squadrons across the Pacific. Knowing Betty's vulnerabilities allowed American fighter pilots to target specific weak points with lethal precision. The knowledge drawn from captured aircraft saved American lives and shortened the war. Now come back to where we began. A captured Japanese bomber on a Pacific airstrip. American engineers standing over open fuel tanks,